I saw something fascinating happen last year in South Korea. In convenience stores across Seoul, you'd find well-dressed young professionals and university students frantically buying up boxes of concho, a simple chocolate biscuit, the kind you pack in a kid's lunchbox. But they weren't eating them. They'd tear open box after box right there in the aisle, peering at each little biscuit. They were hunting for something specific. When they'd find it, a biscuit printed with their own name, or maybe the name of a K-pop star, their faces would just light up. They'd snap a quick photo for Instagram and then immediately start ripping open the next box. This little marketing gimmick kicked off a nationwide frenzy. Shelves were cleared out daily. It was, for all intents and purposes, a panic buy. But what was so strange was the feeling behind it. This wasn't the tense, anxious hoarding we see for toilet paper or gasoline. Nobody was afraid. It was joyful. It was a panic driven by the fear of missing out on a game. And that's when it hit me. The same invisible psychological wires that can cause a run on the banks or empty a supermarket of rice can be tripped by something as trivial as a chocolate cookie. It proves that panic isn't just one thing. It's a fundamental switch in our brains, and it can be flipped by fear or, bizarrely, even by fun.
That concho example, it's actually a perfect, if maybe slightly unusual, way into what we study in behavioral economics. Because, standard economic theory, it gives us this picture of humans as these perfectly rational robots.
Right, the econs, who weigh every single pro and con perfectly.
Exactly, the mythical creatures, yeah. They calculate everything. But behavioral economics, well, it's the field that really shows quite definitively that we are not econs, we're human.
Okay.
Our decisions are limited. Profoundly limited, actually. We use cognitive shortcuts all the time. We react emotionally. We get swayed by what everyone else is doing. But the really interesting part, these reactions, even the ones that seem totally illogical, they're often deeply predictable.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. For this deep dive, our mission is really to get under the hood, isn't it? Explore those specific psychological levers, the wires, as you call them, that trigger mass buying. We need to understand not just the kind of panic buying driven by, say, anxiety or crisis, but also this more intentional kind, where brands might leverage FOMO or even joy, like with the biscuits, to get people to buy now.
That's exactly right. We need to look beyond just the big crisis headlines and really understand the underlying psychological operating system that's at play in all these situations.
So if we're stripping it right back, what's the foundational concept? What limits our so-called rationality and makes us vulnerable to these panics, whether it's about cookies or, essentials like rice?
The big one, the anchor concept, is bounded rationality. Now, this isn't saying people are irrational or dumb. Not at all.
Okay.
It just suggests that people try to make rational decisions. They really do. But they're limited. They face some pretty severe constraints. Think of it like trying to run complex software on a computer with not quite enough memory.
Right, it struggles.
It struggles. And the constraints are everywhere. There's external stuff, like just sheer information overload, too much data about every possible choice, every potential crisis. And then there are internal limits, our cognitive shortcuts, our emotions, the huge pressure we feel from society.
So, because we can't possibly process everything.
Exactly. We can't analyze every single variable for every decision. So we rely on mental shortcuts, heuristics, and, well, sometimes those shortcuts lead us way off course, dramatically astray, even.
That makes a lot of sense. We're always trying to save mental energy, aren't we? Okay, let's look at how these shortcuts play out when the panic is driven more by external fear. You mentioned a pretty stark recent example from Asia.
Yeah, the Jakarta rice panic. This was back in September 2025. And it's such a critical case study because the panic wasn't triggered by, an actual collapse of the supply chain. It was sparked by credible rumors of just a minor disruption.
Even though the government was saying things were okay.
That's the key part. The government had actually put out assurances saying overall rice supplies were stable, they were safe. But despite that, premium rice just vanished from the mini markets almost overnight.
So how does a rumor beat official data like that? What's happening in our heads?
Well, that's the availability heuristic in full force. It's one of those cognitive shortcuts. Basically, our minds give much more weight, more importance to information that's immediate, vivid, easy to recall.
Like seeing an empty shelf.
Precisely. That visual image, the empty shelf, the possibility you can't feed your family, that's incredibly vivid and immediate. It just overrides the more distant, abstract statistical information coming from, say, a government official on TV. The brain sees that empty space and translates it directly into danger, act now.
So the gut feeling, the visceral image, trumps the numbers. And then I suppose once a few people start acting on that instinct, it just snowballs because of social pressure.
Absolutely. That's where herd behavior kicks in and, crucially, transforms a potential scarcity into a very real manufactured one. We are fundamentally social creatures, you know?
When you see your neighbors or even just strangers in the supermarket rushing, loading up their carts, emptying the shelves, the fear of being the only one left without, that fear just overrides almost any personal logic or rational assessment you might have made moments before.
It sounds a bit like, people understand that if everyone just bought what they needed, things would be fine. But they still rush in and buy 10 bags of rice. Isn't that a bit like the prisoner's dilemma we hear about in game theory? Like a consumer version.
It's an excellent parallel. It's a classic collective collaboration problem. In the prisoner's dilemma, you have two individuals, right? If they both act purely in their own immediate self-interest, if they both defect, they end up worse off than if they had cooperated.
Right.
Well, here, cooperation means just buying your normal bag of rice. Defection is hoarding 10 bags. Hoarding seems rational for the individual in that moment. It maximizes your immediate security, minimizes your personal risk of going without.
But if everyone makes that same rational choice to defect, to hoard, then the collective good, which is a stable, predictable food supply for everyone, it gets destroyed. The very act of hoarding, driven by that initial fear, actually creates the shortage everyone was afraid of in the first place.
Wow. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy fueled by fear.
It's the tragic feedback loop of panic buying. Individual rationality, in this case, leads directly to collective irrationality. The result is a crisis literally generated by our own behavioral biases.
Okay, so that covers panic driven by the fear of, say, physical shortage. Let's shift to another really powerful type of consumer panic, the kind driven by wanting to avoid financial regret. This often happens with big-ticket items, doesn't it? Like that iPhone pre-tariff frenzy in the U.S. back in April 2025. That seems like a perfect example.
Oh, absolutely. That's a textbook case, really.
Right.
It perfectly demonstrates two other really fundamental biases: anchoring and loss aversion. What happened there, you remember, was this widespread anticipation that a new tariff would hike the price of the latest iPhone by something like 43%.
A huge jump.
Massive. And people rushed out to buy before this tariff was even officially confirmed, let alone implemented.
Walk us through the emotional calculation happening there. Why the rush?
Okay, so first, you've got anchoring. The current price of the iPhone, the one people were used to seeing, becomes the anchor. It's the fixed mental reference point. It dictates our whole sense of what that phone should cost, its value.
Right.
So any anticipated price increase from that point feels disproportionately painful. It feels wrong, unacceptable, because it's moving away from that comfortable anchor point we've latched onto. We almost feel entitled to that current price, you know?
Like that's the real price.
Yeah.
And then the loss aversion part kicks in and turns that feeling of it being painful into, I absolutely must act now to avoid this pain.
Exactly. Loss aversion is, well, it's arguably one of the most powerful forces in behavioral economics. The core idea is that the psychological pain of a potential loss in this case, the pain of imagining yourself paying that extra 43%, maybe $430 more for the phone later, that pain feels roughly twice as intense, twice as powerful as the pleasure you'd get from an equivalent gain.
So it's not even about, ooh, I want the new iPhone. It's more like, oh, God, I can't bear the thought of losing that $430 if I wait.
Precisely. The primary driver isn't the pleasure of getting the new gadget. It's the overwhelming urge to avoid the future regret. People were buying immediately, not necessarily because they needed a new phone right then, but because the imagined pain, the loss of that money later, felt so real, so immediate, that they had to act now to prevent it, even if their current phone worked perfectly fine.
Okay, so we've got panic fueled by fear of shortage, like the rice, and panic fueled by fear of financial loss or regret, like the iPhones. Now, let's pivot a bit and talk about, well, the perhaps slightly more cynical side of this, how brands, how retailers intentionally use these exact same psychological levers, not just responding to panic, but actively creating urgency to drive sales.
Right. This takes us squarely into the realm of, let's call it, intentional agency, or strategically employing these biases. The commercial goal here is crystal clear. It's about conversion.
Getting people to click buy.
Getting people to click buy. It's about turning someone who's just browsing into someone who makes an immediate committed purchase. And they do this by making the product feel less like just another item and more like a kind of high-stakes social experience. Think back to those Concho biscuits again. They weren't just selling a cookie, were they?
No, they were selling the thrill of the hunt, the status of finding your name, the fear of missing out on the game everyone else was playing.
Exactly. And that taps directly into the huge power of FOMO, the fear of missing out. And it works so well, as you hinted, because of loss aversion again. The emotional pain we feel from the idea of losing out on something, an experience, a deal, a limited item, is just psychologically stronger than the pleasure we anticipate from gaining it. It's loss aversion, but weaponized for retail.
So it's the scarcity principle, basically. Make something seem rare, and suddenly everyone wants it more.
That's the scarcity principle in its most commercial form, yes. When brands signal that an item is scarce or exclusive or hard to get, we instantly perceive it as being more valuable. And this tactic is incredibly effective in today's world because it cuts through what psychologists call decision fatigue.
You mean when you're scrolling online faced with 50 different types of, I don't know, running shoes?
Exactly. Your brain just gets overwhelmed, it shuts down. But urgency and scarcity, they act like a cognitive shortcut. They slice right through that noise, that fatigue, and they push you towards making an immediate decision rather than deliberating or, crucially for the retailer, clicking away.
It basically kills the "I'll save it for later" or "I'll think about it" response.
It eliminates the online retailer's greatest enemy, yes. The purchase happens almost automatically, sometimes before conscious thought really gets a chance to engage. And brands, especially online, have become absolute masters at using really precise, almost surgical tactics to maximize this effect. When you look closely at how they implement this stuff, the language, the visuals, it's meticulously engineered.
Okay, so give us the breakdown. What are the specific tactics, the cues, that really work, that push those buttons?
Well, we can look at giants like Booking.com or Amazon as kind of the gold standard here. They use scarcity cues that are incredibly specific, focusing on low stock levels, and precision is key.
It's not just selling fast.
No, that's too vague. It's much less effective than something concrete like Booking.com's only 2 rooms left on our site, or Amazon's only 5 left in stock. That specific low number does something in our brain. It anchors us to the immediate, tangible reality of potential loss. It makes the scarcity feel real, urgent, and the impulse to grab one becomes much stronger.
And they often combine that scarcity with urgency mechanisms, right? Putting a clock on it somehow.
Absolutely. They create time-bound pressure that forces you to act now. Amazon's lightning deals are the classic example. They don't just show a countdown timer ticking away.
Which is stressful enough.
Right. But they combine it with a progress bar, often showing visually how much of the deal has already been claimed, like 75% claimed. So you see both time running out and the available stock shrinking right before your eyes. That combination really ramps up the emotional pressure to buy.
And they even do it with delivery times.
Yes, those hyper-specific delivery time messages like, order within 2 orders in 15 months to receive it by tomorrow. That ties the urgency directly to immediate gratification. Delaying doesn't just mean you might miss out. It means you actively lose time. You push back the moment you get the thing you want.
And underpinning all of this, they often use social proof, don't they? Showing that lots of other people are interested or buying right now, reinforcing that FOMO.
Oh, that's essential. Social proof signals high demand, which implies value. Booking.com is brilliant at this. Messages like, in high demand, or even more specific, booked 100 times in the last 24 hours.
What does that do psychologically?
It tells the potential buyer 2 critical things. 1, this thing must be good because look how many other people want it. And 2, you're already behind the curve. You're late to the party. Which means if you don't act right now, you risk the social pain, the regret of being left out while everyone else got the good room or the hot product.
It really is a kind of masterclass in applied behavioral psychology. But it also forces us to think about the ethics, doesn't it? Brands are essentially intentionally manufacturing anxiety to drive sales. It feels like a tricky line to walk.
It is a very tricky line. And authenticity becomes the absolute critical boundary. If the scarcity or the urgency feels manufactured, if it's clearly exaggerated, or if a brand just uses these tactics constantly on everything, customers pick up on that.
Yeah, you start to distrust it.
You start to distrust it, it feels manipulative, and that inevitably damages long-term trust, breeds cynicism. The immediate goal might be conversion, sure, but if achieving that goal relies on causing significant cognitive distress or exploiting biases too aggressively, the customer relationship itself gets damaged, possibly permanently.
And there's data showing this tension, this potential downside for brands.
Oh, there's a huge tension. They're backed by data. Look, on one side, the absence of urgency is undeniably bad for online sales. Research suggests something like 69% of online shopping carts are abandoned, often because there wasn't that time-sensitive push. So urgency clearly works. It's often necessary from a business perspective.
But the flip side.
The flip side is significant. That same research shows that impulsive, FOMO-driven purchases lead to buyer's remorse, genuine regret in roughly 45% of cases.
Wow, nearly half.
Nearly half. So for that short-term conversion, brands are potentially sacrificing long-term customer satisfaction, loyalty, and positive word of mouth. Get the sale now, but maybe lose a customer later.
That's a really profound trade-off for any brand to consider.
It forces them to ask a fundamental question, really. Are we actually selling a product or a service? Or are we primarily selling the anxiety that this product or service might disappear if you don't act immediately?
Okay, so we've looked at panic driven by fear, panic intentionally stoked by marketing. Let's pivot now to what feels like the most critical application of all this knowledge. How governments, public health bodies, organizations can use these principles not to create panic, but to manage large-scale, unwanted panic. Thinking about crisis management, ensuring fair access to essentials.
Yes, this is where understanding behavioral economics shifts from just being interesting theory to becoming absolutely critical public policy. Because unwanted panic buying, hoarding, whether it's rice, toilet paper, medicine, it disproportionately harms the most vulnerable people in society.
How so?
Well, people who maybe can't afford to buy huge stockpiles up front, or people with mobility issues who can't easily get to multiple stores or can't go during those peak chaotic buying times. So policymakers desperately need tools, communication levers that are targeted, quick, and actually effective in calming things down.
And often, instead of just resorting to strict rules or maybe angry public warnings, the first tool we look at is more subtle, isn't it? Using things like pro-social framing or behavioral nudges. There was that great anecdote from Java you mentioned earlier.
Yes, the story of Pak Budi, the village head in Java. It's just a fantastic real-world demonstration of managing perception with a clever visual nudge. He was facing down rumors of a rice shortage, things were getting tense, and he wisely figured that just issuing stern warnings telling people not to panic might actually backfire.
Right, telling someone not to think of a pink elephant.
Exactly. It might just amplify the fear, put the idea of panic front and center. So what did he do instead?
He used a visual counter nudge, you said.
He did. He didn't just say everything was okay, he showed it. He organized a large, stable, highly visible stack of rice bags right near the market entrance. And crucially, he put up a simple sign. It read, "Beras cukup untuk semua," which translates to enough rice for everyone.
Ah, the genius there is the framing, isn't it?
Yeah.
He didn't focus on the potential scarcity everyone was worried about. He framed the default situation as one of community sufficiency. Stability.
Precisely. That simple, concrete visual cue, combined with the positive framing, provided an immediate, tangible counter-narrative to the abstract, scary rumor mill. It guided people, nudged them towards more collective, responsible behavior. Imagine a shopper arriving, maybe intending to buy way more than usual because they're anxious. They see that big, calm stack of rice. They see the sign reassuring sufficiency. They see maybe that others aren't grabbing wildly. It gives them pause. It provides social proof of stability. And maybe they just buy what they need for the week. The focus shifted successfully from individual anxiety and acquisition to a sense of collective trust and stability.
That really underscores how blunt warnings can sometimes backfire, which leads perfectly into that big Australian experiment that specifically tried not to use the phrase panic buying.
Yes. That study was really insightful. They tested different messaging interventions designed to curb hoarding during a potential crisis. And they were very careful, as you said, to avoid the term panic buying itself in their messages. Why? To avoid that backfire effect where just talking about the undesirable behavior inadvertently makes people think about it more, maybe even normalize it.
So they tested different kinds of appeals. What actually worked best to reduce people's intention to hoard?
The most effective message, by a significant margin, was the one that appealed directly to morals. It emphasized the impact of hoarding on vulnerable people. The language was quite direct, maybe even using a touch of shame or responsibility. If you're greedy and buy more than you need, the state's most vulnerable people will miss out.
Strong stuff.
Strong stuff. And it worked. That powerful moral appeal significantly reduced both people's stated intention to panic buy and their actual behavior in a simulated shopping task. We're talking a 42% relative decrease in the likelihood of hoarding compared to a control group. It really hit people at the level of their core values, their sense of community responsibility.
That's a huge finding for anyone crafting public health messages. Appeal to the conscience. What about the message that tried to promote positive social norms? Encouraging cooperation.
Right, they tested that too. A message framed around norms and reciprocity. To help your family and your community, please buy only what you need and think of others when you shop. most people do the right thing.
How did that one perform?
Really interestingly, it performed differently on intention versus behavior. That message failed to significantly change people's reported intentions. They still said they intended to hoard at about the same rate.
Wow.
But it did still significantly reduce their actual simulated hoarding behavior by around 39%. This difference points towards something called pluralistic ignorance.
Okay, pluralistic ignorance. What's that in this context?
Right. So when surveyed, the average person rated their trust in other shoppers behaving responsibly as pretty low. They basically assumed everyone else is going to be selfish and hoard, so I probably should too, just to be safe.
Even if they wouldn't normally do that.
Exactly. But the simulation showed that the majority of people, actually close to 80%, did not panic buy excessively. Pluralistic ignorance is that gap. I privately believe hoarding is wrong, but I assume most other people approve of it or are doing it, so I might go along with the perceived norm.
I see. So the message, most people do the right thing, helps correct that misperception.
Precisely. It bridges that gap. It informs people that, contrary to their cynical expectations, cooperation is actually the norm. Correcting that misperception about what others are doing then helps reduce the bad behavior that stemmed from the false assumption.
That's a really key insight for crisis comms. Actively tell people that their neighbors are mostly cooperating. Okay, one more message type they tested. The straightforward reassurance about supply. The logical approach.
Yes, the scarcity reassurance message. Something like, Australia produces 3 times as much food as it consumes. Factually true. Logically reassuring.
And the results.
It did succeed in reducing people's expectation that shortages would occur. They believed the message, felt reassured about the overall supply. However, it did not translate into any statistically significant change in their actual simulated buying behavior.
So just knowing there's enough isn't sufficient to stop the impulse once fear kicks in.
Apparently not powerful enough on its own. Once that loss aversion, that fear of personally missing out gets activated, simply knowing the macro-level supply is okay doesn't seem to be enough to curb the individual hoarding instinct for many people.
This all really highlights how crucial communication is, which brings us to the media and its often complicated role during a crisis.
Oh, profoundly complicated. The media's framing of events can massively amplify panic or potentially help mitigate it. There was some really detailed analysis done on global media coverage during major crises like the COVID-19 pandemic.
What did it find? What frames dominated?
Overwhelmingly, the coverage was dominated by 2 specific frames. First, the human interest frame. This accounted for nearly a quarter of all stories. Lots of focus on personal tragedies, individual suffering, emotional stories.
Which connects with people, obviously, but maybe becomes emotionally draining if it's constant.
It can be, yes. But the second dominant frame was arguably more problematic in terms of panic, fear scaremongering. This included using really inflammatory language describing local outbreaks as apocalyptic, constant dramatic warnings about second waves, focusing relentlessly on rising numbers without necessarily providing context. This kind of sensationalized coverage demonstrably accentuated public fear.
And the consequences weren't just abstract anxiety, right? You mentioned measurable health impacts.
Absolutely. This wasn't just about people feeling stressed. The alarmist framing correlated directly with measurable psychological and even physiological consequences. We saw reports showing significant rises in self-reported panic attacks in places like the UK. And crucially in the US, prescriptions for anti-anxiety medications jumped by 34% by mid-March 2020. That reversed a 5-year trend where usage of those drugs had been declining. It really shows the tangible public health cost when media coverage leans too heavily into sensationalism during a crisis.
Was there any counterbalance? Any positive framing?
There was. The hope frame existed. It actually ranked 3rd in frequency, making up about 12% of stories. These were the reports focusing on solutions, on recovery efforts, on resilience, maybe profiling local leaders urging cooperation, or highlighting falling infection rates successes.
But it was drowned out.
It was often crowded out, yes. Crowded out by what the researchers called the media's obsession for breaking news, which often prioritizes drama and immediacy. This lack of consistent, coherent messaging that focused on solutions and resilience likely contributed to the public's heightened fear. It undermined people's sense of self-efficacy, their belief that they and the community could actually cope with and manage the crisis effectively.
Okay, we've covered a lot. Panic triggered by fear, panic leveraged by marketing, panic amplified or potentially managed by communication. So, for the final piece, what about us? What can an individual consumer sitting there feeling those psychological wires start to pull actually do to fight back against these biases in ourselves?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And ultimately, the most powerful tool any of us have against market volatility, against emotional tides, is starting with self-awareness, recognizing and then actively working to counteract our own cognitive biases. It means shifting from just passively receiving information and reacting to actively interrogating our own internal responses.
Let's go back to that iPhone example, the financial analyst who felt the pressure to buy before the tariff hit, but resisted. How did she manage that internal fight against loss aversion?
Right. Imagine her internal state. She felt that visceral alarm bell going off. Don't lose $150. That feeling is powerful. It's immediate. It demands action. But crucially, she was able to recognize that feeling for what it was. She could label it, that's loss aversion talking.
She identified the bias in real time.
She identified it, and that recognition allowed her to pause, to interrupt that automatic emotional response. Instead of just acting on the fear of loss, she forced herself to step back and do the rational calculation.
Weighing the pros and cons more objectively?
Exactly. She weighed the immediate emotional urge, avoid the loss, against a longer-term, rational financial picture. She reminded herself, my current phone works fine. That $1,000 I'd spend now could be invested instead. By focusing on the potential gain from investing that money, which might well outweigh the $150 tariff cost over 6 months, she successfully counter-programmed the emotional pain of the potential loss. It took deliberate analytical effort, but it allowed her to resist the impulse and make what was for her a better long-term decision.
So that conscious pause, that interruption of the automatic response is absolutely key. Reminds me of that research into something called Nudge Plus, which found that standard nudges sometimes fall flat when people are just overwhelmed with information.
Yes, exactly. The Nudge Plus research is fascinating. It suggests that in really high information, high stress situations like a global pandemic, for instance, the classic simple nudges often just get lost in the noise. They get crowded out, as the researchers put it. There's just too much competing information, too much anxiety. You need something more to cut through.
Or something that forces a deeper level of engagement.
That's precisely. You need something that encourages more personal reflection. So the researchers tested different messages aimed at increasing compliance with public health guidelines during a crisis. They found that just using a standard social norm message, most people are doing X, or even highlighting an identifiable victim, telling the story of one specific person's suffering, like Sam, the 72-year-old retiree. Neither of those worked significantly well on their own to boost adherence intentions. People were just sort of numb to standard warnings by that point.
Okay, so what was the plus element they added that made the difference?
The plus was integrating a reflective task. They didn't just give people information. They asked participants to actively do something with it. Specifically, they asked them to pause and write a short note, maybe just a few sentences, to a relative.
Oh, what?
About the specific steps they were personally taking to comply with the guidelines, and importantly, why they felt those steps were important. The simple act of having to articulate your own intentions and reasoning, especially framing it as if explaining it to someone you care about, forces a kind of internal consistency check.
So it's not just hearing the message, it's making it your own through reflection. Self-persuasion almost.
Exactly. That reflective task, that moment of self-persuasion was the added ingredient. When combined with the identifiable victim nudge, that combination significantly increased people's initial intention to actually follow the guidelines. By asking the individual to stop, think, and articulate their commitment, it broke through the information overload. It encouraged more deliberate, thoughtful, and ultimately more socially responsible thinking. It moved them from just passively hearing advice to actively engaging with it and internalizing the responsible behavior. That made the decision stick.
This whole journey we've taken, starting from something as seemingly trivial and fun as a panic over chocolate biscuits, and moving through serious issues like rice shortages and pandemic responses, it really shows something fundamental, doesn't it? Consumer panic, whether it feels joyful or terrifying, whether it's high stakes or low, it isn't just random chaos. It's not a failure of intelligence. It's actually a powerful and remarkably predictable set of human instincts responding to cues in our environment, cues about scarcity, about what others are doing, about potential loss.
And that really is the essential synthesis. That's the key takeaway for you, the listener. We are human. We are therefore boundedly rational. We rely on these mental shortcuts, these emotional responses. And whether these cognitive mechanisms are being intentionally leveraged by marketers trying to sell you something using scarcity to trigger your FOMO, or whether they're being activated perhaps unintentionally by governments trying to manage a crisis, The underlying psychological mechanics were largely the same. They're universal. Understanding how these invisible wires work, becoming aware of them in yourself and in the messages you receive, that's what empowers you. It empowers you to critically evaluate your own impulses, to resist unnecessary panic-driven buying or decision-making, and hopefully to shift from purely reactive fear toward more deliberate, considered, and responsible behavior. In any market, in any situation, awareness of the game is really the first and most important step to playing it well.